All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orson with Emerging Revolutionary War. I am here with good friends Mark Malloy and Mark Wilcox, the Marks as we call them here in ERW. We're here to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, um, a holy day for some, especially Mr. Malloy up there in the green. But we're going to talk about Irish Americans, great Irish from all over the world that participated in the American Revolution on both sides and had high influence on how the war was conducted and left a legacy that we still see today. So just kind of start off with this is our way of celebrating. I do know Mr. Mark has his beer in hand, and Mr. Mark Wilcox has his tankard in hand, which is our traditional way of doing things here. But Mr. Malloy, let's start off with you, since you are my go-to leprechaun in our bunch. Why do you think that? What kind of role do you think, generally speaking, did the Irish play in the war? That's a big question, and we're going to dive down into that. But kind of give me why you think it's important to talk about the Irish as it relates to the American Revolution.
Yeah, so first of all, the American Revolution is the starting story for America, and of course, we were settled by British immigrants, and a large portion of them were Irish. Estimates vary, but there was a large proportion of the Continental Army was actually made up of either Irishmen or people of Irish descent. So there's a lot of Irish that played an important role in the founding of America. And in the first major struggle during the Revolutionary War, the Irish are heavily involved, really on both sides. And that's something I think we'll talk about tonight. Is that the Irish are on different sides, and you have all sorts of different people from Ireland. So people who are unfamiliar, I mean, Ireland is you have big divisions between the Catholics and the Protestants, but you really had men and women from both of those areas coming over to America and find themselves in this struggle. In addition to that, so the Irish are going to play a big role in the Revolutionary War. In addition to that, what happens here in America eventually spills over into Ireland, and there's going to be rebellions that break out over there based on what was happening over here in America. And then you have, as America grows throughout the 19th and 20th century, all sorts of Irish immigrants coming to America. They're going to look back at the history of what the Irish did during the Revolutionary War and really celebrate that and commemorate that to really show how important the Irish were in our founding and to help their communities in the future. So there's a lot of stuff going on because the Irish played an important role, and what happens here really impacts Ireland as well. So I think it's something that oftentimes we think of it as British versus Americans, and you don't necessarily think of where the Irish fit into this, and they're really all over the place. So.
And so broad spectrum here. Not to dive too deep, but we talk about the Irish. Uh, Mark Wilcox, we have the Scotch Irish in the South. So, what's bringing the Irish here? I don't need a detailed answer to that, but just give people an idea, like why are the Irish population immigrating to the United States? And we're not, well, the colonies, I should say. And we're not talking like the massive, 19th century migration of Ireland that we kind of read about a lot. But what's bringing the Irish to the colonies before the war?
You know what? What brought the English to the colonies in the 17th century? It's land.
Money, yeah.
The idea to be able to make money and be your own man, your own person, and especially the Scots Irish, who are traditionally poor, and what land is available to them? It's frontier land that is still in dispute by native tribal nations, and also why would these men fight? Again, land bounties, opportunity to have something for their families, and that's a bit a motive. We talk about the Civil War, rich man's war and a poor man's fight. I think you had a lot of poor Scots Irish who were joining the fight just to come out better at the end, if that makes any sense.
And good fighters too, as Mark and I know about studying the Southern campaigns. The Scots Irish are good fighters, and we're talking mostly Protestant. Am I right, Malloy? These aren't your traditional, as we think today, Catholic Irish. This is more of a Protestant background. Am I correct?
Yeah, no. Yeah, most of them are Protestant. Of course, there are some Catholics that do come over, but yeah, oftentimes, back in Ireland, because of penal laws and everything else like that, most of the Irish Catholics within Ireland, weren't allowed to own their own land or, own firearms. There's all sorts of restrictions that were placed on the Irish Catholics. So, and them having the opportunity to come to America was often difficult. And you mentioned before, during the 19th century, there's kind of a mass migration, after the famous Irish potato famine, where you have large amounts of Irish Catholics coming over. But in the 17th, 18th century, there's not as many of the Catholics. And then when they were coming here, you have to remember that here in America, there was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment. And many colonies, where we are right now in Virginia, it was the law of the land that, you had to be Protestant or you had to attend a Protestant church, Anglican specifically. So even though there were different denominations, the ministers had to still be Anglican ministers, and the colonists had to pay, tithes to the Anglican Church. And so many of these colonies were very much anti-Catholic, but you had some exceptions. Of course, famously Maryland, which was this kind of created as a haven for Catholics. So you do have some Catholics going in there, but it's like I said, with a few exceptions, largely it was very difficult in America for Catholics to be able to worship freely in many of the colonies. And of course, through the struggle for liberty during the Revolution, some of the ideals of religious liberty are going to really start to come to the forefront. Especially here in Virginia, where the Statute of Religious Freedom is passed shortly after the war. So yes, religion is a big factor. It was a big factor in Ireland at the time. It's a big factor in the colonies at the time. But there are Catholics, at that time here in America. And I think a lot of people forget, I mentioned Maryland being an exception. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence was Catholic, Carroll from Maryland. So there were Catholics that were involved, but yeah, they were a smaller minority than the Protestants. So most of them are going to be Scotch Irish. Yes.
And you kind of jumped into what I was going to bring up about leadership. Talk about Carroll. So since you're also a Washington fan, how did Washington approach, this kind of mixed bag men in his army? I know we're talking about Irish tonight, but you brought up the religious, perspective of this. Washington wasn't Catholic, as we know, but how did he look at integrating these different religions in his army? Because we know he's trying to integrate all the states into one continental. How did he approach the religious aspect?
Yeah, no, it was a big issue that Washington's going to have to try and essentially walk a tightrope where he wants to unify people together and look past, breaking down of the differences of religion. And he does that pretty early. And one of the things that the Protestants used to celebrate was the Guy Fawkes Day, where they would celebrate that often was filled with a lot of anti-Catholic celebrations. And Washington's going to ban the practice of that when he takes command of the army. He is also going to, as kind of a olive branch to the Catholics and the Irish, recognize St. Patrick's Day when he's in command of the army. Washington himself is going to actually, attend some Catholic services or Catholic mass, later after the war as they're trying to unify the country. But Washington's a big a proponent of looking past the religious differences and unifying their cause altogether. And he has a good understanding of some of one of his friends who was in Alexandria before the war was an Irish Catholic named John Fitzgerald. John Fitzgerald emigrated to America and he settled in Virginia, where again, like I said, it was illegal for him to practice his Catholic religion, so he'd do it privately in his home. But he becomes a big businessman in Alexandria, Virginia. He becomes friends with George Washington. When the war breaks out, Fitzgerald joins up with the 3rd Virginia Regiment, and he's quickly promoted onto the staff of George Washington, and he becomes an aide-de-camp to Washington. He's by Washington's side at Trenton, Princeton, Monmouth, where he's wounded. Before that, he was at Valley Forge. So he's kind of with him throughout the entire war. And Fitzgerald, after the war, is going to work with help establish the Catholic Church in Virginia. And so after that statute of religious freedom is passed in Virginia, he's going to establish the first Catholic Church, which is still there in Old Town Alexandria, St. Mary's. And Washington actually helped give some of the first money to create that church. So that was a pretty important to have Washington believe in this ideal of religious freedom and worked hard to acknowledge that they really had this kind of diverse army and try to protect their ability to work together to fight the British during this war.
Yeah, and you kind of jumped ahead. I was going to ask about leaders of Irish descent, and John Fitzgerald obviously is a big one. Where Mark and I live here in Northern Virginia, I remember as a kid seeing the plaque for John Fitzgerald down Old Town Alexandria. It said bosom friend of Washington. And as a kid, Mr. Wilcox, that always made me chuckle.
It probably still does.
Yes, it does. I know. I'm a kid at heart. But so talk about Mr. Wilcox. We're talking about the Americans, and we tend to think of today, and we'll talk about this later, about how the Irish were resistant to British rule, being part of the empire. But there are quite a few British soldiers who are from Ireland or Irish descent that are actually fighting in the war, and actually, as you and I know about the Southern campaign, contribute quite well in the South. Can you kind of chat about them for a little bit so we can balance out the Mark Malloy pro-patriot side here?
Well, I think the two Marks are both Irish. I'm half Irish, but it still counts. That a regiment that fought at the Battle of Camden, August 1780, the Volunteers of Ireland, and this was a provincial regiment, meaning they were well trained, they were well supplied, and they form up in 1777 in the Philadelphia area and join the British Army in New York. And they're designated the Second American Regiment as just, again, provincial troops, loyalist troops, and we know Americans fought on both sides, no question about that. But the Volunteers of Ireland are under the command of an Irish nobleman, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Lord Rawdon, and Rawdon he brings in more recruits, and these are kind of a hodgepodge of Irish troops, provincial troops from various loyalist units. So he's really putting together just a core of well-trained Irish provincial troops, Volunteers of Ireland, and they'll actually join Sir Henry Clinton as he comes down to move the war to the southern provinces in 1780. And once Charleston has fallen in May of 1780, the Volunteers of Ireland are pretty active in the Southern campaign, and they'll start off at Camden. And when you look at the Battle of Camden, this is early morning of August 16th, 1780. The two armies Patriot Army under Major General Horatio Gates. His vanguard at 2:30 in the morning on August 16th literally blunder into the British Army marching out of the small crossroads town of Camden. But they are under the command of the new commander in the Southern Department for the British, Lord Cornwallis, Charles Cornwallis. And they are really bisected by the Great Wagon Road. So both armies will have half on one side of that road, half on the other. And the Volunteers of Ireland are going to line up on the left of the road. Cornwallis is going to line up his more veteran regiments, the 33rd and 23rd Regiments of Foot, on his right. The place of honor, which, Rob, we've talked about in the past, that is it a myth about the place of honor? Perhaps it goes back to the Spartans, maybe goes back to ancient Greece, where you would place your strongest warriors on the right-handed, holding their shields with the left to try to maybe work the flank of the enemy, and so then eventually becomes traditionally the place of honor. And we do see that quite a bit throughout the Revolutionary War on both sides, Horatio Gates as well on the American side there at Camden. But the left of the road for the British, under the overall command of Lord Rawdon, and closest to the road is going to be his own Volunteers of Ireland. And on that morning, they're numbering right around 300, and again, very, very well trained. They do get chewed up pretty badly. They're actually at Camden. They are really lined up against the 2nd Maryland Brigade. That brigade is commanded by Mordecai Gist, but pretty much the Volunteers of Ireland are lined up against the 1st Delaware, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Vaughn's Delaware Regiment. And guys, this brigade, some of the toughest combat troops to ever come out of the Continental Army. And the Battle of Camden was short. It's extremely short. It's less than an hour. But in that time, on one side of the road, Horatio Gates has American volunteers, greenhorns, lined up against some of the best troops the British have, and they cut and run pretty quickly. And so the American left flank disintegrates, but it's the American Continentals on the right doing battle with these provincial troops, not only the Volunteers of Ireland, but the infantry units of Van Astor Tarleton's British Legion. You've got the North Carolina Royalists, North Carolina Loyalist Militia. And they're gonna get chewed up, especially the Volunteers of Ireland. They're going to take quite a bit of loss here at Camden, forced back. But the difference in these provincial troops is their training, is their weaponry. And even though these men will get pushed back by the Continentals at Camden, they won't break. They'll bend, but they won't break, and they will be able to push back against the Patriot Americans here on the side of the road. And we know the story of this battle. Finally, Tarleton's dragoons get into the rear. Now the Continentals, who were pretty much on their own and commanderless, as Horatio Gates has fled. He's going to be 180 miles. It takes him 3 days to do that, destroying his own career. And so the battle is over. But the Volunteers of Ireland is a crack combat unit, and they'll continue on in the South. They'll fight at Hobkirk's Hill in April of 1781. They'll march to the relief of the small town, the western town of 96 that's being besieged. And of course, they do surrender with Lord Cornwallis's forces at Yorktown. And interestingly, after the American Revolution is over, they get a designation into the regular British Army. They are the 105th Regiment of Foot. But when the war is over, eventually they get disbanded. They're not sent back to England because the British Army, British High Command, does not want these Irish troops going back to England. They got enough trouble with Ireland back there. So they wind up being resettled in Canada. Interesting.
Yeah. And it's, as we always talk about the Southern Campaign, it's, a civil war.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because you have Irish on both sides of that field, fighting people of Irish descent, fighting back and forth, which is so typical of that theater of the war where there's, neighbors fighting each other, people of the same descent fighting each other. Happens, obviously, we talk about with the American Civil War, but really happens a lot in the American Revolution as well.
Yeah. say we usually think of the Battle of Fredericksburg with the Irish Brigade going against the Irish and the Stonewall.
Don't bring that up. That's a kind of, anyways. Go ahead, Mark. Mark's been watching too many movies.
In popular memory, but I don't think people necessarily think of the same thing when it comes to the Revolutionary War. You have Irish immigrants on both sides fighting each other on many of the battlefields here during the Revolution.
You know, and it's not just in the military. I mean, we're talking about the South Carolina backcountry. We're talking about what a civil conflict that was. By the time Horatio Gates and Baron de Cobb and their Gates's Grand Army march into the backcountry, that's already a violent place, already a volatile place. But there's fighting going on, less about whether somebody wants to gain their independence and more about vengeance and more about settling old scores between old neighbors who are now enemies, that kind of thing. Politics actually was kind of a background. It's just a civil war. The Waxhaws, right there on the border of North and South Carolina, where there's a battle between Banastre Tarleton and Abraham Buford's Virginians, and that's remembered as a massacre, which is really overstated. But this is land that was settled by poor Scots Irish, really part of the frontier at that point. Birthplace of future U.S. President Andrew Jackson.
And as you guys were talking, I was trying to find a really good quote. Mark, I'm not sure if you're going to bring up Mr. Malloy about George Washington Parkcustus had a great quote about the Irish in the Revolution. And I was going to read it really quick. He talked about who led the right wing of Liberty's forlorn hope, General Sullivan at the passage of the Delaware, who felt the privations of camp, the fate of battle, the horrors of the prison ship more keenly than the Irish. Washington loved them, for they were the companies of his toil, his perils, his glories, and the deliverance of his country. Parkcustus goes on and talks about Montgomery at Quebec, as I said, Sullivan at Trenton. So talk a little bit, Mark, about George Washington Parkcustus and his role in the memory of the Irish in the American Revolution. I think, he's got many quotes here. I won't, fill up the whole hour with quotes from Parkcustus. I know Mr. Malloy would love that, but why did he see it as his role, his job to talk about the Irish that fought on the American side?
Yeah, so and those who don't know, George Washington Parkcustus was Martha Washington's grandson. And he was raised, he was born right near the end of the war. He was born in 1781, and he was raised by George Washington at Mount Vernon. And he later goes on to build Arlington House, which is today Arlington Cemetery, and was later the father-in-law of Robert E. Lee. So he was kind of this figure that connected, two eras of American history. And he built his home, Arlington, not just as a family residence, but really as a memorial to George Washington. He was absolutely enthralled with what Washington had accomplished during his life, and he was committed to making sure that his memory would live on. And that was through display and curating historic artifacts related to Washington, and was just a real proponent of securing the Washington legacy, to make sure that Washington's vision and ideals lived on into the country throughout the 19th century. Now, one of the really interesting aspects is that George Washington Parkcustus is not only a huge proponent of George Washington and the early Federal Republic, he is also a huge proponent of Irish history, and the importance of the Irish played during the Revolution. He actually said there should only really be 3 national holidays in the country, and that would be the 4th of July, George Washington's birthday, and St. Patrick's Day. That's kind of the level of how important he saw the Irish.
That's how it is in your house, right, Mark?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe Christmas. Maybe Christmas. Maybe Christmas.
And yeah, all throughout the 19th century, he passes on many stories from the Revolution because he knew personally men like John Fitzgerald in Alexandria. And so he would hear the stories from the men and the people, Washington himself, what they experienced. And then in the 19th century, really would write about them, would give speeches about them. And so he's really a wealth of information of what happened during the war. And yes, he was a huge proponent of Irish getting their home rule over in Ireland, but really saw that their contributions during the Revolution meant that they should have equal rights here in America as well. And frequently, in addition to writing and speaking about the Revolution, he would speak at St. Patrick's Day events and other things like that in the Washington D.C. area. But yeah, he has some great quotes and some great stories that he was able to pass down that really focus on how important the Irish were. And one of my favorite stories is he said, that after he died, the only thing he would want is somebody to come, an Irishman, to come place some shamrocks at his grave after he had died. And for many years, different Irish heritage groups have done that, and he's buried today, yeah, in Arlington National Cemetery. A pretty neat tradition. But yes, he was definitely a main proponent of making sure that people remembered what the Irish did, especially in that early 19th century period. And then I think as we get into the later 19th century period, as more and more Irish immigrants come to America, they're really trying to find these stories of how the Irish helped create this country and memorialize them. And one of those that I think we should talk about too is Timothy Murphy, because I know that he's a Irish immigrant who really gets memorialized in the late 19th century. I think there's a monument to him up there at Saratoga battlefield. And there's many things written during that time period as him being representative of kind of a typical Irish immigrant who helped the cause of American independence.
And Tim Murphy was part of Morgan's rifle corps, Daniel Morgan, and you see there's a reproduction Pennsylvania rifle on my wall right behind me, and I was speaking about this earlier. What's available? What land's available to poor immigrants when they come here? It's frontier land and or land bounties after the war, that kind of thing. And so, what kind of men are making up Daniel Morgan's rifle corps? A lot of Scots Irish. And these are frontiersmen. These are tough guys, right? They said they were men with the bark on, and it didn't matter your age. It could be young guys, it could be older guys, but you have to take care of your family, right? You got to defend your family. You got to provide for them. So, in the frontier, these were men who had to be jacks of all trades, blacksmiths. They've got to be woodsmiths, metalsmiths, whatever they need. They can't just go and take it to a specialist if there's the rifle's out of repair. They've got to be able to fix it themselves. So gunsmiths as well. And these men have frontier skills. If their livelihood is dependent upon their weapon, on their long rifle, which we know is slow to load. It's not the miracle weapon that I was led to believe it was in the Revolutionary War when I was a teenager. But in the right hands, you're looking at a weapon that could kill a man accurately at maybe 100 to 200 yards, maybe a little bit more. Long hunters, like people like Daniel Boone, who was Welsh, so we won't count him in this, but still men who were providing for their families based on their marksmanship. Tim Murphy is one of those gentlemen who was able to provide long-range fire. And he is credited at Saratoga with dispatching Brigadier General Simon Fraser. This is one of the closest friends that the British commander, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, had. And he's deeply mourned. He's got a son who is a junior officer commanding light infantry there at Saratoga. And, this is a practice that really enraged the British command, knocking off British commanders. And these sharpshooters with these long rifles were adept at being able to cause that confusion in the British ranks by knocking out officers. So You know, and I also want to credit the Scotch Irish that we refer to now as the Over Mountain Men, men of the Watauga settlements,
Right.
who actually come east across the mountains when they're threatened. They're threatened by Patrick Ferguson, who wants to keep them out of the fighting, and he sends a message that if they do not stay out of this conflict, he is going to march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their settlement to waste by their country to waste by fire and sword. And guys, you know, here's the 3 rules that I've lived my life by that I swear by. Rule number 1: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Rule number 2: if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. Rule number 3: never, ever threaten anybody from East Tennessee. They don't take to it very kindly. And so you see what happens. These men muster and they cross the mountains and they form up with all the militia from Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And October the 7th at Kings Mountain, Patrick Ferguson's whole command just about is wiped out. And Cornwallis loses his left flank and has to fall back into South Carolina. So these men are formidable warriors. They're formidable fighters for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot, didn't forget, but you make a good point about the Over Mountain Men and uh, making sure never get into a fight with someone from East Tennessee. That's funny.
Okay.
Um, so kind of moving forward here, Mark, well, I'm going to ask you because you're my go-to when it talks about Irish liberty and Irish freedom, as you see on your shirt there, Liberty. So, what by the time of the American Revolution, what is the perception in Ireland of the king, the Parliament, British rule? We see some notable, uh, Irish people of descent fighting for the crown. Lord Rawdon, who Mark just brought up, who's left in command when Cornwallis moves north and fights numerous other battles like Hobkirk's Hill and others. So, I mean, he obviously had no problem fighting for the king, at least, on the surface. So, what's the thought process there in Ireland of, I know we're going to talk about the revolution here in Ireland a little bit later, but what what is the thought over there under British rule? So you do have some British soldiers who are from Ireland, and they don't seem to have a problem fighting for the king.
Yeah. And again, a lot of it really comes down to the divisions that are within Ireland. So Ireland had been under English rule for hundreds of years at this point. And like I said, there was this division where the kind of Irish Catholic peasantry had most of their rights taken away from them. There was a Protestant kind of class that owned many of these things and kind of ruled the country at that point. And so many of these people, like Rawdon, are from that Protestant upper class in Ireland. Yes, many of them are joining up with the British Army. And of course, like I said, a lot of the Catholic peasants, they're not going to have much access to anything, although they are going to hear about what's going on in America. And then you also have this other class of what they call dissenters. So there's a bigger class of Presbyterians in Ireland. And some of these Protestants are going to see what's happening in America. And then what happens in America eventually spills over into France with the French Revolution, which of course was very bloody and disruptive in that country. But some of these dissenters and Presbyterians, they're going to see what's happening in Ireland, and they're going to advocate doing something similar in Ireland, and that is getting rid of this division between Protestant and Catholic, uniting everybody, and they create an organization called the United Irishman. And their goal is going to be to lead an uprising to overthrow the British and take Ireland back and make it a unified country and kind of, like I said, unite both of those classes. And so One of those guys is a man named Theobald Wolfe, who is kind of the Irish George Washington over there, who's going to lead this effort. And you have a lot of people after the Revolutionary War happens who are going to be big advocates of this movement. Probably the most famous, Thomas Paine, is going to be very much active in arguing for the rights of Ireland to be free from Great Britain as well. And so, yeah, these United Irishmen are going to eventually stage an uprising in the year 1798. And it's in fact, some of the British who were involved in America are going to be involved in this uprising. One of them, his name was Lord Edward Fitzgerald, different from the John Fitzgerald in Virginia. Edward Fitzgerald actually comes with the British. He actually fights at the Battle of Eutaw Springs down in South Carolina, which is a terribly bloody battle. And after the war, he goes back to Ireland, and he actually becomes an advocate, sometimes through this war experience, and they see, how well the Americans fight for their liberty and how good their lives are over there. He actually comes back to Ireland and is an advocate of Irish independence. And he's involved in the United Irishman. But before the rebellion's even able to take place, somebody ratted them out to the authorities, and most of the leaders are captured, including Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and is actually killed in an altercation with when he's being captured. So he's killed during that. There was another man, actually, the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia had this great exhibit a couple of years ago about Richard St. George, who was actually fought in America. He was actually wounded at the Battle of Germantown. And there's a great painting of the Battle of Germantown. You can actually see him in the corner of the painting being carried off the field. And he goes back to Ireland. And even though he's also in favor of Irish rights, some of the United Irishmen saw him as a symbol of British authority, and he's actually killed in the early stages of the 1798 as well. But they have some great paintings of him, and like I said, the Museum of the American Revolution did a little display on him, which is pretty interesting. But that's kind of showing you how these two conflicts were kind of very much interconnected.
Hey, Mark, also mentioned who's one of the major British generals in that revolution in Ireland.
Our favorite Charles Cornwallis.
Talk about the connections there, right? Poor Cornwallis leaves here and gets to go over there and deal with the Irish.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, you can kind of see it in a lot of their symbolism as well. Yeah, you can see my shirt actually was a flag that was carried during the 1798 rebellion. That was actually carries the motto that Patrick Henry actually said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And so yes, there's this attempt, and like I said, because all the leaders were kind of taken out very early. There was some of the rebels out in the countryside do rise up. They're actually able to defeat the British at a couple places. There's actually an invasion from France, because France, of course, at this time is looking to do whatever they can to help England's enemies. And they actually land some soldiers into Ireland, and there's some fighting that takes place there as well. But because, most of the Irish rebels, didn't have access to rifles or muskets, most of them rise up with just pikes. And so all these pikemen, they have one final last stand at a place called Vinegar Hill, down in southeastern Ireland. That's you can actually see behind me in that painting. It's a pretty bloody engagement where the British ultimately overrun them. And that's pretty much the high watermark of the 1798 rebellion. But the British are pretty ruthless about anybody who was involved in this rebellion. They kind of go through all the people who had been captured. Most of the people who are captured are either exiled or executed. So they don't really kind of play around with the people who are involved in this. Which kind of gives you a glimpse of how Great Britain treats people who rise up against them. And of course, they did that to the Scottish after the 1745 uprising. They do it to the Irish here in 1798. Makes you wonder if the Americans were ultimately captured, what kind of fate would be dealt to them. But they were very, very brutal on suppressing this rebellion. And it would be there would be a few more, but Ireland is a place of really kind of ever since 1798 constant uprisings. But one of the things that changed, Ireland had been fighting against the British for hundreds of years at this point. But really, what the 1798 rebellion does is it really tries to make it not so much about Catholic and Protestant. It should be all united Irishmen against Great Britain. And that's kind of a common theme that you start seeing as the Irish continue to advocate for independence through the coming, centuries.
Yeah, I also think too the harshness of that's probably got to do with proximity, right? Putting down rebellion thousands of miles over the ocean as one right next to Scotland obviously being connected and Ireland just being across the water a little ways. So I always think that maybe they're a little bit harsher because it's a little bit closer to home.
Yeah.
That's just my take on that. But no, you're right. It is very harsh. We talked about, as we start to wrap up here, this always goes by so fast, just chit-chatting. As you were talking about, I think Wilcox was talking about Daniel Morgan. And I mentioned Richard Montgomery a little bit in George Washington Parkcustus' letter there. Does anyone want to talk about Montgomery's role? He's such an early martyr to the American cause with his death in Quebec. I remember, working at a historic site here in Virginia, and one of the few prints that we had that was from the original house, Richard Blandly's home of Selly Plantation, was, a print of Montgomery going down, because it was, even in 1790s, it was being memorialized in a way that today we won't even talk about that much. Does anyone want to kind of chit chat about Montgomery a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just add one little thing before you get started, Mark, is Montgomery, it was such a huge loss because he was such a charismatic leader. Right. I mean, men followed him, and to go down so early, and you have to wonder, what could he have accomplished had he survived Quebec? Yeah,
that was a forlorn hope on his part, I think. But go ahead, Malloy.
Well, no, I mean, I'll just say, Montgomery, he played such an important role as a martyr for American independence, and you're right. I mean, and he's an example of some of these guys that you read about and you find out, oh, he was born in Ireland. It's kind of interesting because you don't think of that. And I'd rather talk about Montgomery than, of course, Conway. I don't know if we want to talk about him.
No, we should do that too. I mean, we're all encompassing here on both sides.
Yeah. And it kind of shows you that, in some cases, Montgomery, he did have I think he had a bright start ahead of him. But leading his men from the front, charging up Quebec in the middle of a snowstorm, on New Year's, and they gets hit with grape shot right in the head and is killed. And emerging Revolutionary War hasn't been up to the site yet, but it's on our docket to get up.
Well, we were going, then COVID hit, so everything.
But
anyways,
you see his name Montgomery, all these Montgomery counties,
right.
Him, and like I said, right up there with Joseph Warren and Hugh Mercer. Right in the year or two of this war, you have these high-profile military men who go down, and then like I said, they become martyrs for their cause, and people celebrate them, especially now. Most people probably don't know about Conway because his memory is mostly tied. His name is mostly tied with the Conway Cabal. And he was an Irish officer in Washington's army. And there's still a lot of unknowns as far as exactly what was happening, but there was believed to be a cabal, a gathering of some of these officers under Washington, throughout 1777 and into 1778 to find a way to knock Washington off and put in either Charles Lee or Horatio Gates. Conway is often a central figure in that whole debate. But of course, after the Battle of Monmouth, pretty much all of that talk goes away. And Conway himself, I'm not sure exactly if I don't remember if he was cashiered or what exactly happened to him, but yeah, like I said, he's basically forgotten after that. And he never had a prominent role in any of the major battles either. So.
And after he is shot in the duel, and he ends up over in France. From what I remember, he's in the French Revolution, and almost he's fighting for the royalists and almost dies, and has to seeks kind of a not pardon is the wrong word, but seeks help from Britain to get out of France, and he flees France, and so he bounces around quite a bit. But I do think where there's smoke, there's fire with him, right? Well, I guess what's important to say is Washington believed it, and that's all that mattered, because that had a huge impact, especially on Horatio Gates later on. That's a whole different conversation. Yeah. But so as we wrap up, let's talk about celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And I'm going to look to Malloy on this one. And then, Mark, I'm going to circle back to you for another question. Because, Mark celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a holy day. You can't even call Mark on St. Patrick's Day. But how was that traditionally celebrated? We think of today, I started tonight before we went live with my silly St. Patrick's hat. But that's more of a modern interpretation of St. Patrick's Day. So how is it looked at in the 18th century, and how has that evolved into the craziness that we have today of dyeing rivers green and all the other stuff that we do?
Great
question.
Well, primarily it was a religious holiday for St. Patrick. And yeah, so people would, obviously celebrate Mass. But it kind of morphed into a larger celebration of Irish heritage overall. But you do have, one of the interesting things, and there are some really fascinating St. Patrick's Day during the Revolution. Really one of the first ones in 1776 on St. Patrick's Day is the day that the British evacuate Boston. And Washington actually makes his countersign St. Patrick. And they march in and they capture the city. And to this day, the city of Boston it's officially the holiday isn't St. Patrick's Day. Officially, the holiday is Evacuation Day, because this was a great celebration of finally driving the British out of Boston. And so, but yes, so that was one big St. Patrick's Day. But Washington also, in his general orders, like at Morristown, also authorizes a celebration for St. Patrick's Day. And alcohol, of course, is a part of that. So they were given, I believe, extra rations of alcohol as well for that. And the men could celebrate in that way. But yes, as far as and I like that you mentioned this whole dyeing rivers green and everything. The whole aspect of wearing green as a symbol of Irish heritage, a lot of that is born out of the 1798 rebellion as well, because the United Irishmen took green as their color. And the British actually are going to outlaw it in many of so they weren't allowed to wear the green or display the green flag and that kind of stuff. So that became a symbol that they would cling to of their cause. And like I said, it continues all the way up until today when people wear the green on St. Patrick's Day. So I think it's definitely evolved, but something that has come to symbolize just a general celebration of Irish heritage. But at the time, it was much more of a religious holiday for sure.
And Mr. Wilcox, how do you all celebrate there in the Wilcox house, since you are the more holier of the three of us on this call? Uh, how how do the Wilcoxes celebrate St. Patrick's Day?
Well, Lord knows I grew up a Southern Baptist, so we weren't drinking green beer or anything like
That's right.
that. Well, I mean, what we've always done is you wear green so no one pinches you, and you watch The Quiet Man with John Wayne on television, that kind
Oh,
of
look
thing.
at that. I like it.
Yes, sir. But you know what I mean? I do. I think about Dorchester Heights on St. Patrick's Day, and I do think about the evacuation of Boston and the retaking of Boston. But I like to think about the fact that so many of us in this country now are people of Irish descent, whether it's full-blooded, half-blood, whatnot. And these were people who built this nation, in my opinion. And the Irishman is usually the butt of the joke, but I think our country was founded on these immigrants, these people who came here to settle.
No, I agree 100%. And I think there's a lot more to dive into. Books you all recommend to read on some of this stuff. I was talking about places to visit. We always bring about that with Emerging Revolutionary War. Mark just mentioned Dorchester Heights there, small national park there in Boston. Obviously, Boston itself has many great historic sites to talk about the evacuation day. I do think it's kind of neat that we think of Boston today as an Irish town, right? Irish city. Some great movies like The Departed. I just took Mark Malloy to Southie a few months ago, I should say, and get that true Irish experience. But in the colonial days, it wasn't necessarily Irish, but they evacuated on St. Patrick's Day. I think it's just such a cool tie-in to that colonial history, to the 19th century Boston history that a lot of us know about. Places to go, things to read, recommendations.
Yeah. I would say there's a book called about George Washington and the Irish. It's kind of interesting that highlights some of the Irish stories we mentioned here tonight, but then also other ones like the fact that James Hoban, who behind the White House, he was an Irishman. Kind of goes into to more of the Irish who were involved really in the whole creation of the country in those early years. There's we had on one of our revelries earlier. You can go back and you can listen to it. A book about the 1798 rebellion and the archaeology and other stuff that were happening.
Oh, that's right.
There, which is pretty interesting, and I think that ties into places to visit. I think you mentioned Boston, but you can also, and I mentioned the monument at Saratoga to Timothy Murphy. But yeah, no, one of the neat things that I had the ability to go to Ireland about 10 years ago, and I was actually able to go to Vinegar Hill and many of those battlefields from that 1798 rebellion still exist, and those are really kind of neat battlefields to check out. So I think thinking of it internationally is kind of cool. Not just where Irishmen fought in this country, but also where they fought in their own country. Those battlefields still exist too. So
yeah, it's great stuff, Mark. I'm thinking more locally. As far as books, one of my favorites is Patrick O'Kelly's Nothing But Blood and Slaughter, the Revolutionary War in the Carolinas in 1780, where you get a good overview of the struggle here in the North and South Carolina backcountry, and that involved, Scots Irish, involved volunteers of Ireland, on both sides. It's definitely a civil war. And with that mentioned, Kings Mountain is one of my favorite sites. The Battle of the Over Mountain Men, and a lot of those North and South Carolina battlefields. Definitely my recommendation.
And there's a great book about Camden too that people can pick up, right, Mr. Wilcox?
I've heard some good stuff about that one. Yeah.
There you go.
What a coincidence. You have it.
All that can be expected. Yes, I'm still working on my footnotes, by the way. These kids get in the way. All right, gentlemen. Well, we are about done. Does anyone have any final thoughts before I wrap us up?
Well, I was going to say there's also a book called To the Last Extremity. And on the cover of that book
I
is
don't have that one here.
on the cover of that book is another Irishman, Sergeant William Jasper. We didn't get a chance to talk
Oh,
about
yeah,
him.
that's right.
They still celebrate him down. Savannah has a huge St. Patrick's Day celebration, and they still celebrate his memory down there. But if you want to hear more about him, check out the book To the Last Extremity. Just came out. So
And there's a good statue of him too, as well, in Charleston. Am I correct?
that's correct. You
That's
can read
right.
it.
So all kinds of things to go out there and see. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for sitting in tonight. Thank everyone for watching. Just kind of want to mention our next revelry is March 31st. Looking forward to this one. We have historian Shirley Green with us talking about her recent book, Revolutionary Blacks, Discovering the Frank Brothers, Freeborn Men of Color, Soldiers of Independence. We've had a couple discussions about Black Continentals, Free Blacks, and African Americans have fought for Great Britain, and this is a new book just came out. She's done some great research on the Frank brothers, and looking forward to having her join us on March 31st here at 7 p.m. Thank you, Mr. Malloy. Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. You guys enjoy your Guinness, your Black and Tans, your Coke Zeros, and your Irish stew. Thanks, guys, for joining us. See everyone in 2 weeks.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
That's right.
St. Patrick's Day.